Hi scholars, welcome to chapter 2 of our text, The Middle Ages, Knights, Castles, and Chivalry. Today we'll be reading the chapter about To the Manor Born. And if you've never heard the word manor, it's not a very common word, but a synonym, a word that means the same thing as a castle, is the manor house. So we'll be learning a little bit more about that today. You will need some paper again to write our new vocabulary words, and then also we'll be doing some work with some prefixes today, as well as classifying words as nouns, adjectives, adverbs. So the first page that you can get out, you can make this little chart for yourself. So I have my notebook where I've been writing down my work for guided reading as we go. And this is telling us that nouns, you can just write these two boxes right here will be important for us to keep track of. Nouns are words that name people, places, or things. Hopefully that's review, that's something familiar to you, but it's good to keep track of because as we're writing more complex sentences, as we get older and move on to middle school, we'll need to know these things to make sure we're using our grammar correctly. And then there's two types of nouns that we're talking about. Common nouns are general words and are not capitalized. You know, we always capitalize the first letter at the beginning of a sentence, but in the center of our sentence, we want to make sure that the common nouns are not capitalized. And then proper nouns are specific and are capitalized. So names of people and places are capitalized, they're proper nouns. And then another type of word that we're talking about today are adjectives that are words describing those nouns. So once I have this jotted down, you can pause if I was working a little bit faster than you were ready for. And then when you're ready, just unpause the video and we'll continue. So there will be a picture of this in the Google Classroom. The directions say write in period above the nouns and ADJ period above the adjectives. So our abbreviations for noun and adjective, so you don't have to write the whole word out. And then you'll draw an arrow from each adjective to the noun it describes. The information following each sentence provides a clue about the number of nouns and adjectives you should find in each sentence. So in this example, the sentence says, the old, wise king speaks to his young son. And it lets us know before we start searching that there are 2 nouns and 3 adjectives in this sentence. So the nouns that they labeled were king and son. And then the adjectives describing the king are old and wise. The adjective describing the son is young. So there we found, our 3 adjectives and our 2 nouns. And sentence number 1 we can do together. You can just add this right below your anchor chart to remind you of these things. Let's write kings gave land to loyal lords. So I know that kings are people, places, and things are nouns. So over the word king, I'm going to write my in period to show that it's a noun. Gave land to loyal lords. Land is a thing. I'm going to put an in over land. And then lords are a word to describe people we'll learn more about in this chapter. So over lords, I will put an N and a period. So we've got our 3 nouns, we found those. Now we need to find 1 adjective. Kings gave land to loyal lords. What kind of lords are they? They're loyal. That's describing the types of lords. So that is our adjective. So you should have a sentence that looks like this. You'll do numbers 2 through 10 all by yourself, and then you can take a picture of that to turn in on the Google Classroom to me. Some scholars with the questions from chapter 1 actually typed onto the picture I made, and I'm not sure how they did that, but if you can figure that out, that's great too. We're also going to start a chart on a separate paper for prefixes. We'll be using this throughout the rest of this text in different chapters, so you'll want to keep it safe to hold on to. So at the top, I'm titling this page prefixes, and then I have the definition. A prefix is a syllable or syllables, more than one, placed at the beginning of a root word to change the word's meaning. And we'll get to some examples of this in a minute. So for now, we're just setting up our paper so we can use it today and in our other chapters. So I've got this, and then I will draw a line down my page to make a smaller column and a wider column to talk about the word's meaning. This is the practice that you'll have today, just like the last paper. But for this one, instead of having to write out the whole sentence, you can just write the number and then the answer that would belong in that sentence. So it says, write the correct word to complete each sentence. Oh, and the title up here says un and non, prefixes meaning not. So both of those prefixes un and the prefix non both mean not. So then we have a bank of words up at the top: uncommon, common, unequal, equal, nonverbal, verbal, non-threatening, threatening. And then each of those will have one extra, it looks like, will go into one of these sentences. There won't be more than one word used each time. So let's do number 1 together. I'm just going to write number 1. Everyone in our classroom has a blank goal. We all want to learn new things about the world. Has an uncommon goal, common goal, maybe. Unequal goal, that doesn't make sense. An equal goal, maybe. Non-verbal, that means something we can't hear someone say. That doesn't make sense. Verbal is someone saying something. Non-threatening goal, no. Or a threatening goal, no. So I'm going to go back to everyone in our classroom has a common goal, that means the same goal, or an equal goal. I think that the best word that would go there is common. So I'm just going to write number 1, common. And then I would know I can't use that word for any other sentences and go on to number 2. So you'll just take a picture of those 1 through 7 to turn into me. And then last, we're going to get these words added to our glossary. So if you have your glossary for chapter 1 and you have some extra space on that page, you could just start adding from there. Let me find mine. It's a few pages back. So the last word we wrote for chapter 1 was nobleman. I can start for chapter 2 here. And our first word is Lord, L-O-R-D. That R controls the O, so we get the or sound in the middle of that word. Lord is a noun. I'll add that part of speech over on the far column. And then the definition is a man in the upper class who ruled over a large area of land. All right. Move on to the next word. Number 2 is lady. We use that word now just to describe a woman, but here, lady is a noun, and it means a female member of the nobility. If you're not quite sure what the word nobility means, hopefully by the end of this chapter you should. So a female member of the nobility. I've heard the word noble before. Number 3 is privileged. Privileged. Privileged is an adjective. It's describing a noun, and it means having more advantages, opportunities, or rights than most people. You may have also heard this word before. It's going to be in a different context in this chapter from your life, but we can probably relate it to some things that are happening today. Number 4 is rival, R-I-V-A-L, which is an adjective that describes a noun, and it simply means competing. So if you love the Cowboys football team, you might have another team that you think is their rival that they're competing against. Then number 5 is loyal, which is an adjective, describes a noun showing complete faithfulness and support. So if you are a loyal friend, even when your friends make mistakes or need some help, you're there for them no matter what. So those loyal lords that we saw in this sentence before were showing complete and faithfulness and support to the kings. All right, and one more word for this chapter is scythe. That's a little bit hard to say. Say that word, scythe. The Y in this word is making a long I sound. This is a noun, it's a thing, and it's a farming tool with a curved blade and long handle, used to cut crops such as wheat, oats, rye, and barley. This would be a good word if you have a picture or an illustration that you see as we're reading. I would jot down a little sketch of that because I know that that helps me put a picture in my mind to go with the word. So for now, I'm kind of thinking it's something like this. It's got a long handle and a curved blade. So we'll see that on on page 15. We can look for it there. All right, just to remind you guys, we saw this in chapter 1. This is showing us that the king has the most power in this society, and then the freemen and the serfs have the least power and protection. The middle class, the merchants and craftsmen, and the nobles, including the lords and church leaders, are somewhere in between. If you need to come back to this picture, you can pause the video as we're working to see that if you've kind of lost track. The last thing we're going to use as we read today, before we start reading, I need a new paper, and I am going to make 3 columns. The first column is going to describe the homes, work, clothing, food, and amount of power. And then at the top, we can put lords in one column and serfs at the top of another column. So in this space, I'm going to be describing the homes of the lords. In this space, I'll be describing the homes of the serfs. When we get to that as we read, we'll pause to fill it in. All right, as we're reading today, we're going to read to find out about the lives of lords and serfs during the Middle Ages. Remember, S-E-R-F is a noun. That's meaning someone who's in the lowest class in medieval society. And we're also going to ask ourselves, how were the lives of serfs and lords different from one another? We're going to see a difference in those today. I'm going to pause the video if you need to catch up on anything while I pull up our reading for today. All right, we're here ready at chapter 2. Remember, as we are reading, if you lose your place, pause so that you can catch up with me and return to making sure you're reading along. You're not just listening. Our big question, one more time, is how were the lives of serfs and lords different from one another? The title of our chapter is To the Manor Born. If you lived during the Middle Ages, your life followed one of a few set paths. If you were the child of a king and a queen, or a lord and a lady, you lived a privileged life. You had enough food to eat and clothes to wear. You lived in a relatively nice house. You had servants too. You may have been one of the few who learned to read and write. You even learned to ride a horse. If you were a boy, you learned to become a skilled swordsman. Privileged girls may have learned to embroider, to dance, to play a musical instrument. Occasionally, girls too learned to read. As a privileged child, you likely grew up to become a king or a queen, or a lord or a lady yourself. But most people in the Middle Ages were not privileged. In the early Middle Ages, nearly everyone in Europe worked on the land. Most farm workers were called serfs. Serfs grew the food and tended to the livestock, or animals that fed the people. Some had more freedom than others and were called freemen. Serfs were at the bottom of the social order and had the least amount of power. So I am going to remind some of my fourth graders. We were reading a story called The Whipping Boy. It was a fictional story, but it was based on real events that happened in the past during medieval times. So the Prince Brat was one of our characters, and the Whipping Boy had the chance to learn to read because he was the son of a king and a queen, but he did not take advantage of that privilege. So the Whipping Boy was actually able to get that privilege living in the castle, even though he was probably a serf or a freeman. And he was able to trick some of the characters later. I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read that yet, but that's what that reminded me of. Serfs usually spent their entire lives working on a landowner's or lord's estates. In return for the work they did, the lord allowed serfs to use some of the land to grow their own food. The lord lived in his castle or manor house. He owned all the land around his home and often the nearby towns and villages too. The lord also controlled the lives of most of the people who worked for him. There's a lot of illustrations here, and I see, oh, maybe that's a sky like we were talking about in our vocabulary. Serfs worked on the land throughout the year. So this caption is letting us know this is showing us throughout the seasons the different ways that the serfs worked on the land. Serfs were not educated. They did not learn to read or write. If serfs wanted to travel to a nearby town, they needed permission from the lord. When serfs wanted to marry, the lord had the right to approve or disapprove of the match. When serfs had children, those children usually grew up to work as serfs for the same lord. So they had a lot of power over the serfs. The serfs did not have very much independence. In the Middle Ages, serfs worked on farmland that was divided into strips. The serfs spent about half of their time working for the lord. The rest of the time, they worked on the strips of land where their own crops were grown. So their own crops were the food that they were growing for them to eat. Most serfs lived in small, simple houses or near a village. Their houses were made from wood and mud. The roofs were thatched, meaning they were made from rushes or straw. They usually had just one room. Serfs slept on straw beds. Inside each house was a small fireplace for cooking. Smoke from the fireplace escaped through a hole in the roof. So I remember we were going to take some notes as we read today. I want you to pause the video right now. We just talked about the homes of the serfs. So you can fill that in a little bit right here with some details, maybe about how they're made from wood and mud. They slept on straw beds, some of those details. So go ahead and pause the video and we will come back in just a second. All right, so I remember we were looking at this chart when we started copying it earlier. I've added some details for the serfs about their homes. Go ahead and so that you can keep taking notes as we go, I want you to make a row for their work, a row for their clothing, a work for their food, and then a row for the amount of power that they had so that you have spaces to add to information about the lords and the serfs. You can pause the video if you need to write that down before we move on. Okay, so we had stopped right here. Now we're going to read more about the lords. The lord increased his wealth in many different ways. In addition to working the farmland for the lord, serfs paid taxes to the lord in the form of money, crops, or livestock. Livestock is animals like cows. So sometimes the lord ran a mill and even charged his serfs a fee to grind their grain into flour. If crops failed or illness struck, people during the Middle Ages struggled to survive. In times of hardship, the lord did not always come to the aid of his serfs. Even when food supplies were low, serfs were not allowed to hunt in the lord's forest. However, to avoid starving, people sometimes hunted illegally. This was called poaching, and serfs who were caught poaching were severely punished. So even though they might have not had any food, remember this is before there were stores to go buy your food, um, they were not allowed to go hunt so that they could survive. Some farm workers were freemen. Freemen were not under the same strict control of the lord. If a serf ran away from his home and managed to live for a year and a day in a town without being found, he could become a freeman too. The Middle Ages was a violent time compared to how we live today. There were frequent wars and uprisings, including rebellions against the king by rival nobles. The need for armed protection shaped medieval society. Usually, high ranking nobles swore their loyalty to the king, and lords swore their loyalty to higher ranking nobles. Freemen and serfs had to be loyal to their lord. In exchange for their loyalty, the serfs offered his protection. If the lord needed to raise an army, he would require freemen on his estates to serve as foot soldiers. And this is giving us a little bit more information. I see a subheading, if you were a boy serf. From an early age, you would work a full day. So even if you are in 4th and 5th grade right now, the age you are now, you would work a full day. You wake up just before sunrise and go to sleep when it is dark. For breakfast, you have rye bread and water, or perhaps watery ale. Even before the sun is fully risen, and regardless of the weather, you begin your work on the land. In springtime, you are busy plowing and planting seeds. You assist in the delivery of baby lambs and calves. At midday, you walk home for a simple meal of rye bread and maybe a small piece of cheese. After lunch, you return to work, cutting logs for the Lord's fire. In the summer months, you tend to the crops you planted in the spring. You keep the hungry birds and insects away from the growing crops. Autumn, the time to harvest crops, is perhaps the busiest time of all. You help your mother and sister pick fruits and berries, which they preserve and store for the winter. Using a simple tool called a scythe, you harvest grain and crops such as wheat, oats, rye, and barley. You help store the grain. A good harvest makes everyone, especially the Lord, very happy. It means there is food to eat during the winter months. A good harvest is a time of celebration for all. So let's go back and look at these illustrations. Remember, there's no photographs at this time. Cameras did not exist, so we only have illustrations to see details of their lives. And this caption shows us this is a boy serf plowing the fields using some cows or cattle to pull this plow from the past. And the boy serf chasing birds away from crops. Here, the boy serf is harvesting grain using that tool that we talked about, the scythe. Nevertheless, you have to get used to having less food to eat in the wintertime and to feeling hungry and cold more often than not. At times, your parents find it difficult to make ends meet. Even if ice and snow lay upon the frozen earth, you still have jobs to do. You have to feed and care for the livestock. You repair fences and barns. All the while, you continue to work on your family's strips of land. Each evening as the sun is setting, you return home quite exhausted. You end your day with a meal called pottage that your mother or sisters have prepared. Pottage is a vegetable stew with grain and a tiny piece of meat or fish in it. After a good night's sleep, you will wake up and do it all again. So here we see an illustration of a serf family eating a meal together. So far today he's eaten 2 pieces of bread and some stew, kind of like some vegetable soup. So that is not very much food. So last we have our medieval musings. We had this in chapter 1 as well. These are topics that you can go and research on your own. So if you find answers, I would love to hear what you guys come up with. The first one says, in the Middle Ages, a kind of food made from grain was used as a plate. What was it? Number 2, in the Middle Ages, people kept coins in clay pots. The pots were made from a type of clay called pyge. I think that's how you pronounce that. Today, many children place coins in a special container, the name of which originates in the Middle Ages. What is that container called? So something that maybe sounds similar to that type of clay pot. Interesting. Number 3, a popular board game that is still played today arrived in Europe from Persia in the 800s. What is the name of that game? The clue says, make sure to check your answer. Over here in this illustration, we see wealthy lords and ladies played games like this. So if you come up with those answers, let me know. And then there's one extra activity here. This is a letter quest, and we'll see this in further chapters as well. So here's an illustration of a stained glass window. You guys may have talked about these in art class, but these are windows that show illustrations of something in colorful glass, and the light shines through. Stained glass windows adorned medieval churches. Most people in the Middle Ages could not read and write. Stained glass windows depicted stories from the Bible and helped to communicate Christian beliefs. Look closely at this stained glass window. A letter of the alphabet has been hidden for you to find. When you find it, record this letter on your journal. After you find all the letters in the letter quest activities, you will rearrange them to spell a word related to the Middle Ages. So this is something, after you find that letter, you have to keep track of that paper so that in the next chapters, as we have more letter quests, you can find that and crack the code. All right, our next chapter will get in more into castles and jousting knights, but that is all we have for today. So pause the video and go back to use it as a resource if you need to, as you're filling in your chart about lords and serfs. And then if you have any extra questions about the worksheet on nouns and adjectives or the work on prefixes, just let me know. You can drop a question in the comments or send me an email. I'm so proud of you guys for doing all of this extra work. You're going to be so knowledgeable when we come back to school, and I will see you next time.